I kind of see myself as kind of I'm a bridge person, kind of between Tom and Liz. I'm going to talk about. I grew up here in Wilmington. In addition to teaching here, I'm from here and grew up here, and I'm going to talk about the um, the impact of 1898 and how it was still felt as I was growing up here. Talk a little bit about segregation, and then I'm going to leave off right at the time that Williston High School was closed, and I think Liz is going to take up there and talk about the Wilmington 10 and what happened with that.
I need for you to help me when I do that.
Okay, go ahead. As Tom talked about, the Wilmington that I grew up in was a different place from the Wilmington before 1898. The Wilmington that I grew up in was in the height of Jim Crow. There was racial segregation in basically all aspects of the city. Tom was talking about segregated beaches. Well, the beaches here were segregated. Wrightsville Beach was segregated. If you're African American, you couldn't go down Wrightsville Beach. You couldn't go on most parts of Carolina Beach. There was a little section there called Freeman Beach or Bob City, and black people could go there for a time. Or many of us would drive up. There was a part of Topsail Beach called Ocean City, and you could drive up there and go to the beach. But otherwise, beaches were closed. You could another place that we would go is I guess about 60 miles up the road. This is not a beach. This is a lake to Jones Lake. I don't know if anybody's been to Jones Lake in Elizabethtown. That was it's a state park, and it was a black lake. It was a lake where African Americans could go. And I was up there recently. I hadn't been in a long time, and it's a nice little state park now, and they have a nice little history of the area. But African Americans would go to the Jones Lake, and there was another lake. It was called White Lake. I don't think it had anything to do with race, but that was the name of the lake. It was White Lake, and whites would go to that. And so again, there was segregation in all aspects. Separate restrooms. My pediatrician, we had separate waiting rooms. There was the white waiting room on one side and the black waiting room on the other side. Restrooms. I can remember being with my father downtown Wilmington, and he had to walk an extra distance to try to find some place where there was a African American restroom that he could use. And we finally ended up going to the courthouse, the big red brick building courthouse there, and they had two restrooms. I mean, they had a white restroom, and they did have a African American or colored restroom in there. And years later, I worked as an intern at the courthouse, and this was years after Jim Crow was officially gone. But I noticed that there were two restrooms there. There was a big, large men's restroom, and there was a little bitty men's restroom. And I recall that. Yeah, I know why there's two restrooms here. One was the white restroom, and one was the black restroom. Belts was downtown. Belts was in the place where the library is, not a public library. And I can remember there the colored and white restroom. I'm a big movie person. Theaters were segregated. In many movie theaters, you couldn't go to them. The Manor Theater, which was on Market Street, that's where all the Disney movies went, and blacks couldn't go there. And so I tell my students, if I'm mean and surly now, it's because I didn't see my Snow White and my Cinderella and that kind of thing. And then you had the Bailey Theater, which was down on Front Street, and there's a little park there. Now it's right across the street from Front Street Brewery. That was the only theater that African Americans could go to, and you had to go up into the balcony and to go there. And one of my vivid memories of childhood is after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed and Jim Crow was gone, my buddies and I went to the Bailey Theater. We went to see Ghidra, the three-headed monster, one of these Japanese monster movies. And we went and we sat downstairs for the first time in Bailey Theater. And it was just a great feeling to be able to go and do it. It might sound kind of insignificant, but it was a big deal for us to go over and be able to sit downstairs in that theater. And so that was and that was just a taste of what Jim Crow was like. It was segregation throughout the city. There were no black elected officials when I was growing up here. We talked about before 1898, there were 3 aldermen and that kind of. There were none when I was elected. I mean, when I was brought up here. There was maybe 1 or 2. I think there were 2 black policemen when I was a child here. The first black elected city council person that I can remember was Kenneth McLaurin, who later was principal at Laney High School, but he was elected to the city council in the 1970s. L.M. Newsom was on the school board in the late 1960s, and I can't remember if he was elected or appointed for a partial term or whatever. But there really were not black elected officials, and you can tell the difference in the way a city is kept up. The last areas in Wilmington to have streets paved were the black areas of town. My street and various other streets were dirt streets well into the 1970s when most other streets were paved. And so you have rain, you have water, puddles of water gathered on both sides of the street. And of course, kids, they would go and slog through the water and that kind of thing. But it was it was a real pain. And so you can see there the impact of not having real political power in many ways. The elections, and this is still somewhat of a point of controversy, it is often argued that one reason that made it difficult for African Americans to get elected in Wilmington was our electoral system, which is an at-large system. And I'm not 100% sure of this. I think that the electoral system before 1898 might have been a ward system or a district system, but after that was changed to an at-large system in which everyone votes for everyone for a city council or a county commission or a type of seat. Those type of elections tend to make it more difficult for minorities to get elected to public office. Wilmington's not under the Voting Rights Act, but there are areas near us that are under the Voting Rights Act in some of our neighboring counties, and they do indeed have district elections, and that is part of their settlement or whatever under the Voting Rights Act. And so oftentimes it's said that at-large elections make it difficult for African Americans to get elected. Of course, I am elected now, and there are African Americans elected to office now, but that kind of thing is often the exception rather than the rule as far as when you have at-large elections. Growing up, the system of Jim Crow did have its rules and regulations, and there was a sense of fear as to what might happen if one got outside of that and that kind of thing. We didn't talk. 1898 wasn't talked about openly as I was growing up, but it was kind of whispered about, and it was in the back of people's minds. And a lot of the older citizens knew about it and told us that. I didn't hear about it in school. In fact, in the 7th grade, we took North Carolina history, And they didn't tell us anything about 1898. I heard about it as from people, the older citizens, talking about it and that kind of thing. And it has to do, to a large degree, with what Tom was saying about the suppression of history and that kind of thing. But just for an example, this is a book called Tar Heel Politics by Paul Lutke, and he talks about a figure who is an important figure in the turn of the century in North Carolina, who had a role in an indirect way with 1898, and that was Governor Charles Aycock. Charles Aycock was one of the Democratic leaders that, in a sense, carried out this campaign to take control of the state. And once Aycock was elected, that was when disfranchisement was implemented in North Carolina in the 1900 when it was done. But when we took North Carolina history, we heard that Charles Aycock was the education governor. That's what we knew about Charles Aycock. He was the education governor. We didn't know about all this other stuff. And so I'm just going to read you just a little section here from Paul Lutke's book. Popular history in North Carolina remembers Aycock as the education governor. Ironically, he could also be labeled the segregation governor. Aycock was a prominent advocate of white supremacy both in the 1898 and 1900 elections. Social harmony necessitated that blacks be disfranchised, he argued. His education programs were supposed to eliminate illiteracy among whites so that they could more easily register to vote. Thus, the education program, as presented by Aycock before the 1900 election, was intended to win support for the suffrage amendment. He did not propose that it help blacks regain the vote. Historian Helen Edmonds has argued that the Democrats promoted education in the 1900 campaign only because illiterate whites threatened to vote against the disfranchisement amendment. In short, were it not for their white supremacy goals, the Democrats might not have even promised educational improvements. So he's the education governor, in a sense, because he was the segregation governor. And again, in school, that was not something that we were taught. But 1898 was behind it, and there was a sense of fear that underlined Jim Crow in many ways. After the murder of the young black teenager Emmett Till back in the early 1950s, parents would tell their kids, and it almost reminds me now of some of the discussions going on now after Trayvon Martin about people telling their kids how to act and this kind of thing. But I remember my mother telling me, and I was just a kid, I didn't understand the full implications of this at this point. My mother telling me, they'll kill you if you look at a white woman in Mississippi. And I thought, well, that means that if you just look at somebody, I didn't know about any kind of sexual implications of it or whatever. And so I remember I would walk around and make sure I wasn't going to look at somebody because I didn't want them to kill me. And so this is the kind of thing that underlie Jim Crow in many ways. The memory of 1898 kind of, many people argue, kind of hampered black Wilmington as far as being, for a time, bold as far as pushing for various things. Certainly this was the view of Dr. Hubert Eaton. Dr. Hubert Eaton, of course, brought the suit that eventually integrated the school system here. And he wrote a book, it was called Every Man Should Try. And in this book, he talks some about the impact of 1898, the impact that it was still having in the 1960s on African Americans. Let's see here. Those older citizens who remembered the race riot of 1898 also feared for their safety, as did many younger members of the colored community who had heard tales of the riot from their parents and grandparents. Years of telling may have magnified the event even more. And let's see here. The terrorism applied by Wilmington whites in the ensuing turmoil, speaking of 1898, frightened the colored community into pitiful docility. It was not surprising, therefore, that our public challenge to the establishment, that is, as far as the school system is concerned, the first such action in over half a century, caused concern to the Board of Education. So he argued that Black Wilmington was sort of, there was a little hesitancy there in certain ways because, again, of the memory of 1898, how that had been passed down. But despite that, Wilmington, and I think was spurred to a large degree by young people, by high school students, Wilmington was very much involved in the civil rights movement. There were sit-ins here. There were demonstrations here. There was an active branch of the NAACP here, and they carried out sit-ins and demonstrations. I was too young to participate in the sit-ins. My parents wouldn't let me do that, but I did have older cousins who did participate and were arrested. I can remember a demonstration that I was allowed to participate in where we marched from a church and we marched down to the steps of City Hall and stood on the steps of City Hall, and speeches were made and freedom songs were sang and that kind of thing. So there was an active civil rights movement that was going on here. And of course, to a large degree, this culminated at the time of in 1968 when or actually a little later than that, around 69, when the Eaton suit was won, and a kind of drastic decision was made to close Williston High School, which had been a source of tremendous pride among African Americans. It's interesting looking back on the Jim Crow era and the segregation era. I think in some ways African Americans look back on it with mixed feelings in some ways. There was the horror of it. There was the shame of it. There was the humiliation of it, of segregation. Some African Americans, though, look back on it, part of it with some sense of nostalgia because there seemed to be a lot more black businesses and things of that nature. There were black institutions that African Americans were proud of. And so I don't think anybody who's thinking completely clearly would want to go back to it just because of these institutions. But there were those things that were there, and I think probably Liz will talk to some of that when it comes to the closing of Williston High School, which was an institution that African Americans were very much proud of, and so. I'm going to. I'm trying to think. I think I've said most of what I'm going to say. In that, 1898 still had a impact on us, and in fact, and Tom alluded to this. Even after, even in the 1980s and 1990s, it had an impact. When the 1898 Foundation started talking about commemorating it. That was a big deal. There were some people who didn't want that to be done. There were some people who wanted that to stay hidden. There were some people who were afraid that it was going to cause riots. I can remember when we had the big commemoration celebration down at Thalia Hall. I think they had the policemen with horses outside and that kind of thing because there were folks who thought that the memory of 1898 was so raw that 100 years later, it was still going to cause rioting and that kind of thing. And so it still cast a pall over the city, even after all of that time. And so I'll just end here and